My sister shrugged. He's young. Let him be. After my nephew just drained thousands of dollars from my card. So I snapped, yeah, he's young. He still has time to learn about consequences. I'm the youngest of three and by far the quietest. Not because I don't have opinions, but because I learned early on that in our family, silence is safer. My sister Vanessa, 2 years older, fills every room with opinions, emotions, and chaos, usually all at once. Our parents found it easier to ignore the storm than stand in it. Vanessa has always been loud, impulsive, and self-centered in a way that almost seemed like a performance. Growing up, she'd throw fits if her birthday cake wasn't the exact shade of purple she wanted, or if the spotlight shifted to anyone else for even a second. And it worked. Our parents tiptoed around her like she was a ticking bomb. Meanwhile, I got my first job at 15, saved my allowance, kept my grades up, and stayed out of trouble. That became my role, the responsible one, the low-maintenance child. The thing about being low maintenance is that people start believing they can lean on you forever, like you're a piece of furniture that never complains. Vanessa got pregnant at 19 and married at 20. The guy bailed before the baby turned 2. That's how my nephew Leo came into the picture. I've always tried to be a good uncle. I'd bring him Lego sets for his birthday, take him to the zoo, help out whenever Vanessa needed an extra hand. She loved to say, "Leo looks up to you," and for years I believed it. Vanessa was always terrible with money. Credit cards maxed out, overdraft fees she blamed on predatory banks, endless complaints about being an overwhelmed single mother, followed by Instagram stories of champagne brunches and salon visits. Still, she was family, and I kept hoping she'd eventually grow out of the chaos. She never did. A few years ago, I landed a major consulting contract and finally started making real money. Not private jet money, but enough that I stopped worrying about every restaurant bill or grocery receipt. I kept it mostly to myself. I upgraded my apartment, traveled a little, paid off old debts, and continued living pretty much the same way. Vanessa found out anyway. That's when the jokes started. Let Calvin pay. He's swimming in it. Don't forget your favorite nephew when you're a billionaire. They were always delivered with a laugh, but carried just enough truth to make me uncomfortable. Looking back, those weren't really jokes. They were expectations disguised as humor. When Leo turned 16, everything changed. I'd given him one of my old iPhones the year before, wiped clean and unlocked. I even offered to pay a few months of his phone plan just to help them out. Somehow, my Apple Pay card remained linked to the device. I should have checked more carefully. That's on me. What happened afterward wasn't. It began with a handful of small charges. I barely noticed streaming subscriptions, app purchases, random amounts under $15. I assumed they were subscriptions I'd forgotten to cancel. Then one afternoon, I noticed a $640 purchase from a store I didn't recognize. I stared at my statement, trying to remember whether I'd ordered new office equipment. Before I figured that out, another charge appeared, $899 for a drone. That finally pushed me to call my bank. The representative walked me through the recent transactions one by one. Designer clothing, electronics, accessories, purchases I would never make. My stomach tightened as the numbers kept climbing. When she reached the total, I honestly thought I'd misheard her. $31,700. Gone. I checked the shipping addresses attached to the purchases. Most had been delivered directly to Vanessa's house. I wanted to believe there was another explanation. Maybe Leo's phone had been hacked. Maybe someone had stolen his account. Then I opened Instagram and saw Leo standing in front of a mirror wearing Gucci and brand new Nike sneakers. The caption read, "Don't worry, Uncle's card pays for everything." Hundreds of people had liked it. His friends filled the comments with laughing emojis and messages cheering him on. I sat frozen, staring at my screen. Then I took screenshots before anything could disappear. My hands were shaking as I called Vanessa. She ignored the call. I texted that we needed to talk immediately. Nearly an hour later, she finally called back, sounding cheerful. "What's up, Cal?" I asked her one question. "Did Leo use my card to buy all this stuff?" There was a pause just long enough to tell me everything I needed to know. Then she sighed. "Come on, it's not that deep. He's just a kid." I honestly thought I'd misheard her. "You think over $30,000 isn't that deep?" She told me Leo didn't know any better, that I made good money, and probably wouldn't even notice that he'd gotten excited and wanted to impress his friends. Then she called me a hard case for making such a big deal out of it. I reminded her that he had stolen from me. She answered, "It's family. Don't act like you haven't helped before." I told her helping someone wasn't the same thing as being robbed. She fired back that I always played the victim and even suggested that if I'd spent more time with Leo, he wouldn't have felt the need to show off. That actually made me laugh. I reminded her I'd given him a phone, helped them countless times, and wasn't their ATM. She insisted I was overreacting. I took a slow breath and said the only thing left to say. Kids learn from consequences. Then I hung up. That night, I barely slept. The betrayal wasn't just about the money. It was the assumption that I existed to finance their lifestyle. Every dinner I'd paid for, every favor I'd done, every time I'd swallowed an insult to keep the peace suddenly replayed in my head. I realized I'd spent years convincing myself that family deserved unlimited patience while they treated my generosity like an entitlement. Around 2 in the morning, I got out of bed, opened my laptop, froze every bank card locked, every linked account, reported the compromised card as stolen, and disputed every unauthorized charge. At 6:42 the next morning, my phone buzzed with a single message from Vanessa written entirely in capital letters, "What did you do?" I stared at the screen for a long moment. For the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty. I felt something far more important: clarity. I didn't reply to the text. I just stared at it while my phone kept buzzing across the kitchen counter. By 8 that morning, Vanessa had called 23 times. My mom had called several times too, and even Leo tried once, though I doubted that one had been his idea. I let every call go to voicemail. I needed space. But more than that, I wanted them to sit with the confusion for a while. For years, I'd been the one expected to understand, forgive, and smooth everything over. This time, they could be the ones wondering what came next. Around noon, the doorman called to say there was an upset woman in the lobby claiming to be my sister and refusing to leave. I told him to say I was out of town. It was a lie. I was standing inside my apartment in sweatpants, but I wasn't ready for the tears, the guilt, or the inevitable switch from pleading to blaming when she realized I wasn't giving in. Through the peephole, I watched her finally storm away, phone pressed against her ear, clearly calling someone to complain. A couple of hours later, my mom called again. "Calvin, what is going on?" She asked, her voice already carrying that familiar tone that suggested I was somehow responsible for the family drama. I told her she could have the short version, or the version where her grandson stole more than $31,000 from me while her daughter told me to get over it. She paused before saying she didn't think that was the whole story. I asked whether she believed I'd fabricated the bank statements. Instead, she said Leo was just a teenager and that I'd always been a little strict. That word irritated me more than it should have. I wasn't strict. I simply believed actions had consequences. I reminded her Leo had knowingly used my card without permission and then bragged about it online. She admitted she'd seen the Instagram post but insisted he probably hadn't realized how much he'd spent. I pointed out that buying designer clothes, expensive electronics, and a drone wasn't the kind of mistake someone made accidentally. Then she said the sentence I'd heard my entire life. "You make good money, Calvin. Can't you just let it go?" I stayed quiet for a moment before asking a simple question. If I'd stolen $30,000 from Vanessa, what would you be saying to me right now? She never answered. I thanked her for proving my point and ended the call. Over the next several days, Vanessa stopped contacting me directly and instead turned to social media. Friends started sending me screenshots of her Facebook posts and Instagram stories. She claimed money had changed me, that I'd rather ruin a teenager's future than forgive a mistake, that I'd forgotten what family meant. Reading them hurt more than I expected, not because I believed them, but because I knew other people probably would. Somehow the man protecting himself from theft had become the villain, while the people who stole from him were the victims. My father never called. That wasn't surprising. Conflict had always been something he avoided until it disappeared on its own. The one person who reached out without judgment was my Aunt Laura. She lived across the country and only saw the family every few years, but she'd always understood the dynamics better than most. She told me she'd watched Vanessa's Instagram rant and wasn't surprised by any of it. Then her tone changed. She quietly suggested I check my credit report immediately. A few weeks earlier, she'd overheard Vanessa asking questions about credit limits and opening new accounts. According to Laura, Vanessa had laughed and said that if Calvin could afford to lose a few $1,000s, he wouldn't miss a little more. My stomach sank. Vanessa knew my birthday, previous addresses, old phone numbers, even the answers to many of my security questions. As soon as we hung up, I logged into a credit monitoring service. 3 recent credit inquiries appeared. 1 new credit card had already been approved in my name. The balance was $5,000, and every dollar had already been spent. I just sat there staring at the screen. This wasn't Leo making childish decisions anymore. This was organized identity theft carried out by my own sister. I immediately froze my credit with every bureau, contacted the card company, disputed the fraudulent account, and filed an identity theft report. Then I called my lawyer. A couple of hours later, Vanessa called again. This time I answered. She didn't apologize. Instead, she complained that freezing my credit had caused problems because her finances were now being flagged and Leo needed a new laptop for school. I calmly reminded her that she'd opened a credit card in my name. She denied it at first, then quickly shifted to emotional manipulation. "We're family, Calvin. Don't let money turn us into strangers. You used to be so kind." For just a second, I almost questioned myself. Then I realized nothing about me had changed. I'd simply stopped accepting behavior I'd spent years excusing. I told her I was done. She accused me of thinking I was better than everyone else because I had money and a nice apartment, warned that I'd end up alone, and promised I'd regret everything. I let her finish quietly, said goodbye, and hung up. Instead of feeling guilty, I felt calm. For the first time since discovering the fraud, I understood that protecting myself wasn't an act of betrayal. It was an act of self-respect. For the next several days, I felt hollow. Not angry, not vengeful, just drained. It's a strange feeling realizing your own sister would rather commit identity theft than admit she was wrong and that your mother would defend her while expecting you to absorb the damage. I ignored messages from relatives saying things like, maybe you two should just talk, or she's still your sister. I wasn't interested in another conversation where I was expected to apologize for having boundaries. I kept going to work, attended meetings, fixed bugs, and met deadlines, but it all felt mechanical. It was difficult to concentrate when my finances had been compromised, my credit was under attack, and my family was publicly portraying me as the villain. One night, I stood in my apartment staring out at the city lights, realizing I hadn't spoken to anyone in days. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt heavy. While looking through a bookshelf, I found an old notebook I'd used years earlier when I dreamed about starting my own software company. The first page contained a question I'd written to myself. What problem are you solving? This time, the answer had nothing to do with technology. My biggest problem wasn't financial anymore. It was that I'd spent my entire life confusing love with unlimited tolerance. I'd never built healthy boundaries because I'd convinced myself that protecting my family mattered more than protecting myself. Under that question, I wrote, "Love without respect is just manipulation with nicer packaging." The next morning, I confirmed all my fraud disputes with the bank and met with several financial advisors to make sure every account was properly secured. One advisor, Layla, gave me advice that stayed with me. She said I should treat my finances the same way I treated my password. Compartmentalize everything and never leave the back door open simply because someone shared my DNA. I followed that advice. I reorganized my banking, created an LLC for my consulting business, moved sensitive accounts, replaced old email addresses, enabled stronger security on everything, and rebuilt my financial life almost from scratch. The work wasn't exciting. It meant endless phone calls, paperwork, fraud alerts, and password changes. But every task made me feel a little less like a victim and a little more like someone taking control of his own future. Then one morning, Leo called. I almost ignored it, but something told me to answer. His voice was quiet, nothing like the confident teenager I'd seen posing on Instagram. He apologized. He admitted that at first he'd thought using my card was funny, because his mother kept telling him it wasn't a big deal and that I could afford it. By the time he realized how serious it was, he said everything had gotten completely out of hand. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I told him I wasn't angry. I was disappointed. He quietly admitted that was probably worse. Then he asked whether I was going to press charges. I told him I honestly didn't know yet. What I did know was that actions have consequences. If I hadn't caught the fraud, it could have damaged my credit, my career, and years of work I'd spent building my life. He said he understood. After a long silence, he told me he missed when we used to spend Saturdays together at the arcade and said I used to be the coolest adult he knew. That hit harder than I expected. I told him I still cared about him, but I wasn't his bank or his safety net. I was his uncle, and I deserved the same respect I'd always shown him. He quietly agreed before ending the call. Afterward, I realized something had changed inside me. For the first time, I wasn't rushing to fix everything or make everyone comfortable again. I was allowing people to experience the consequences of their own decision. That same week, I reopened the notebook and began sketching ideas for a financial security app designed to help freelancers monitor shared accounts, detect unusual spending, and establish healthier financial boundaries. The first prototype was rough, but it worked. As I threw myself into the project, my apartment slowly started feeling like home again. I cooked proper meals instead of ordering takeout, bought a standing desk, hung artwork I'd never gotten around to framing, and invited a few friends over for a board game night. During the evening, my friend Darren looked at me and said I seemed different, calmer somehow. Before thinking about it, I answered, I stopped giving people discounts on my worth just because they share my blood. He laughed, but I realized it was true. Vanessa's online attacks gradually became less frequent. My father remained silent and my mother still didn't reach out. I stopped waiting for either of them. Instead, I focused on building a life that wasn't based on obligation. Then just as everything finally began to feel stable again, a handwritten envelope arrived with no sender's name, only a post office box. The handwriting was unmistakably Vanessa's. Inside was a single sentence. "You think this is over, Calvin?" I read it twice before folding the paper and setting it on the table. Instead of fear, I felt certainty. Until then, I'd spent months reacting to everything she did, freezing accounts, filing reports, defending myself. That letter convinced me it was time to stop playing defense. I gathered every bank statement, receipt, screenshot, fraud report, shipping record, and email connected to the case. As I dug deeper, I discovered something even worse. There were thousands of dollars in older unauthorized charges spread across months of statements small enough that they'd blended into my regular spending. She hadn't stolen from me once. She'd been quietly helping herself for much longer than I'd realized. I organized everything into a detailed timeline and met with Malcolm again. After reviewing the evidence, He recommended sending a formal cease and desist letter warning Vanessa that any future fraud, identity theft, or harassment would immediately trigger legal action. We mailed it by certified mail. 5 days later, she left me a voicemail, terrified that her employer had received notice and was questioning her honesty. She insisted I was destroying her life. I saved the recording. At Malcolm's suggestion, I also sent a simple factual message to the extended family explaining exactly what had happened, supported by documented evidence. I wasn't asking anyone to choose sides. I simply wanted the truth to exist somewhere besides Vanessa's social media posts. Over the next 2 days, my phone filled with messages from relatives who admitted they hadn't known the full story. Several apologized. Even Leo sent another voice message saying he believed me and was sorry for everything. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt like the truth was finally catching up with the lies. The cease and desist letter landed exactly as Malcolm expected. Within days, Vanessa called repeatedly, then left a voicemail. Her voice wasn't angry, this time it was frightened. She said her employer had called her into a meeting after receiving the letter and wanted answers. She accused me of trying to destroy her career, insisted I was humiliating her, and begged me to stop before everything fell apart. I listened to the message once, saved it, and forwarded it to Malcolm. Through Darren and a few mutual acquaintances, I also learned that Vanessa was telling anyone who would listen that I'd fabricated the entire story. The problem for her was that the facts no longer supported the narrative. Too many people had seen the bank records, the screenshots, and Leo's Instagram post. The sympathy she'd enjoyed at the beginning was beginning to disappear. Malcolm suggested one more step. Instead of allowing rumors to spread, I should calmly tell the truth once, then let the evidence speak for itself. I drafted a short message and posted it in the family group chat. I explained that Vanessa had used my financial information without permission, that more than $30,000 had been taken from my accounts, that fraudulent credit had been opened in my name, and that every claim I was making was supported by official documentation. I made it clear I wasn't asking anyone to choose sides. I simply refused to continue being portrayed as the villain for protecting myself. Then I put my phone away. 2 days later, I opened the chat again. There were well over 100 unread messages. Several cousins privately apologized, admitting they'd believed Vanessa at first because they'd only heard her version of events. One aunt confessed that the family had spent years excusing Vanessa's behavior because confronting her had always been more difficult than giving in. Even my father finally sent a short message saying he was sorry he'd stayed silent. It wasn't much, but it was more than I'd expected. The message that mattered most came from Leo. He sent a voice recording saying he'd read everything, believed me completely, and was ashamed of what had happened. Hearing genuine regret in his voice reminded me that despite everything, he was still a teenager who'd spent years watching unhealthy behavior being rewarded. With the fraud investigations nearly complete, Malcolm helped me finalize the remaining legal paperwork. I enrolled in identity protection services, permanently locked my credit with all 3 bureaus, strengthened every financial account I owned, and updated my will. Vanessa was removed from any future claim to my estate. I still included a small educational trust for Leo, but it wouldn't become available until he turned 25, and only if he continued making responsible choices. The rest of my estate would eventually go to an organization that helps victims of financial abuse. That decision brought me an unexpected sense of peace. I finally felt like I was building a future instead of constantly cleaning up the past. A few weeks later, there was an unexpected knock at my apartment door. Vanessa stood outside wearing sunglasses, holding a large envelope. She didn't argue or cry. She simply handed it to me and walked away. Inside was a lawsuit. She claimed I'd caused her emotional distress, damaged her reputation, and interfered with her employment by notifying her workplace about the fraud. Reading it, I didn't feel panic. I called Malcolm, who read through the complaint and calmly said, "Let's answer it properly." We filed a formal response attaching every piece of documented evidence we'd gathered: bank statements, fraud reports, credit records, delivery addresses, screenshots of Leo's post, and Vanessa's own voicemail acknowledging the consequences of her action. At the same time, we filed a counterclaim seeking compensation for the financial losses and emotional damage I'd suffered. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Vanessa's confidence quickly disappeared. During her deposition, Malcolm methodically presented each document until there was little left for her to deny. When he asked whether I'd like to make a statement, I simply said I'd never wanted revenge. I'd tried to resolve everything quietly, but after being robbed, blamed, and publicly attacked for protecting myself, all I wanted was accountability. A week later, Vanessa's attorney contacted Malcolm with a settlement proposal. Vanessa would dismiss her lawsuit and issue a formal apology if I agreed to withdraw my counterclaim. After thinking carefully, I agreed, but only with conditions. She would provide a notarized written confession, acknowledging the fraud and identity theft, complete financial counseling at her own expense, and publicly correct the false accusations she'd spread to both our family and on social media. After some negotiation, she accepted. Her public statement admitted she'd misused my financial information, accepted responsibility for the damage she'd caused, and acknowledged that I'd done nothing wrong by protecting myself. The response from the family was immediate. Several relatives apologized personally. My mother admitted she'd refused to believe Vanessa was capable of hurting me that badly and apologized for failing to stand by me. A few weeks later, Leo told me he and his mother had started counseling together and that for the first time, she seemed willing to accept responsibility instead of blaming everyone else. He hoped that someday we could spend time together again. I told him maybe, but trust takes longer to rebuild than money. 6 months later, the financial security app I'd started designing during the worst weeks of my life officially launched. I called it Iron Key. It helped people monitor shared accounts, detect suspicious activity, and protect themselves from the kinds of financial abuse that often happen between people who trust each other. It didn't become an overnight success, but it found an audience among freelancers and people who had experienced similar betrayals. Looking back, I realized the app existed because I'd finally learned something I'd spent most of my life avoiding. Boundaries aren't a punishment, they're protection. A few months later, I finally took the trip I'd always talked about, spending a quiet week in the Pacific Northwest with nothing but trees, fresh air, and silence. Before leaving, I reopened the notebook that had helped me rebuild my life. On the first page, beneath the question, "What problem are you solving?" I added one final sentence: "The problem of pretending love exists where respect does not." Then I closed the notebook, smiled, and realized that for the first time in a very long while, my life truly belonged to me.